book, Daring Democracy, Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want, co-authored with Frances Moore Lappé. Adam's articles have appeared on NBC, Salon, Huffington Post, among other outlets. In April of 2016, he served as the Deputy Communications Director for Democracy Spring, historic national mobilization for campaign finance and voting rights reform. And since 2015, he has sat on the Democracy Matters Board of Directors, and as the summer of 2017, he acts as a policy consultant to the March on Harrisburg. I give you Adam Eichen.
It's so wonderful to be here. I have to admit that even though I grew up about 6 blocks from here, I've never actually been in this building. So I don't live here anymore. I live in Boston, but better late than never. I want to thank Margaret, Monica, and of course, Danny Hansen, my marcher comrade over there, who I've walked over 200 miles with for democracy. So our bond runs deep. There's not much that you do on a march besides talk. So needless to say, even though I've only known Danny for about 2 years, I seem to know him pretty well. So I want to start with a question. How many people here know the name Brett Kavanaugh? Raise your hand if you know who Brett Kavanaugh is. Well, for those of you who don't know who he is, he's likely going to be the next Supreme Court justice. And I say likely because, barring any unforeseen turn of events, it seems likely that he will be confirmed. Now, there's a lot of stuff going around, and yeah, I see some groans, and groans are right. It's scary. This man is pretty radical. But a lot of the focus has been around issues that will affect us most personally with this new Supreme Court. Environmental regulations will likely be struck down. Dare I say, Roe v. Wade is likely in its waning days, although, frankly, if we be honest with ourselves, it already is, given all the setbacks recently in the South and the other Supreme Court decisions. Labor might be back to the 1920s, and the Lochner Court. We're in for a dark period. We can't ignore that reality. But there's a darker reality that I want to start off with, and I recognize I always have to say, I'm going to get to something more positive, but there's a really important story that's not being told with this Supreme Court fight. And that's, yes, there are issues that are going to affect us most personally with this new Supreme Court. But on the question of democracy, things are going to get much worse. Much, much worse. The Voting Rights Act could be gutted, even more than it already has been. Foreign money might be declared legal to enter into our elections. Direct contribution bans might be up on the table as well, in terms of overturning them. Things can get much worse in our democracy, and the reason why I've been thinking so much about this, because Kavanaugh, if you read his decisions, is no friend of regulations on preventing money in politics. He's no friend to the 14th Amendment. But the reason this is so much scarier to me than anything else that's being talked about is because the powers, the levers of democracy are the one place where we might take our country back. And so this is putting our country on a road towards rule by minority. As we set these regulations, these protections of our democracy that ensure the majority of us can participate and exert our power, as those get rolled back, our ability to create the future that we want, the future that will have a new Roe v. Wade, that will have a new court, that will allow us to regulate the environment, because goodness gracious, we're in the 21st century. We know by now that the Earth's resources are not infinite. We know climate change is a reality. But if we're ever going to get to that point, because yes, things are bad and we can't pretend the reality is good, the short term will be bad. But if we're ever going to get on that future, towards a better future, we have to maintain the levers of power to take our government back, so that no one is talking about the ways in which this new Supreme Court will gut our ability to lever or to change the levers of power. That is much scarier to me than what's being talked about now, because that means we're going to be locked out of power, that we will have a government by a minority. But here's the thing. We already do. We already do have a government by a minority. So it'll make it worse. Yeah, I told you, it's going to be a little depressing right now. Kavanaugh will be the 4th Supreme Court justice recently, 4 sitting on the court now, who will have been appointed by a president who did not win the popular vote. Our current president did not win the popular vote. A block of senators representing states that represent far fewer people than the vast majority, or the other majority of states, block all reform. Wyoming, Idaho, these are the states that block power, block the people's will in the Senate. The Senate is a minoritarian institution. And of course, the House of Representatives, where right now we're talking about a blue wave, and whether or not the Democrats might just squeak by with a majority, even though they're polling plus 10% on the generic ballot. So 10% now gets you maybe 1 or 2 seat majorities now? Is that rule by majority, or is that rule by minority? It's certainly the latter. And of course, the amount of money in politics and other ways in which a handful of people control the levers of power prevents us from creating the society that we want. So things will get worse, but in order for us to make it better, because let's be clear, we will make it better, we have no choice. There is no choice here. We're all in this together, and we're going to live or die by our democracy, because that is where the future lies, in our ability to shape our own future. But to understand that we live in a country where it's the minority that rules, not the majority, we have to understand that this did not just arise out of nowhere. It's not some new thing that Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and oh, look at us, we now live in a country ruled by a minority. No. This trend has been happening for a long, long time, and of course, since our founding, the founding of our country, right? I mean, we are founded on the premise of only white landholding men can vote, that people of color are not people, and that women cannot vote, God forbid they vote. So our democracy has been growing, but it started off at certainly a restrictive place. But it's really in the last 40, 45 years where something has changed. And in the book that Frances Moore Lappé and I wrote, we chronicle this, what we call an anti-democracy movement, because truly it is a movement of people whose goal is to undermine the institutions that allow the majority to turn their will into public policy. In other words, a democracy. And this movement has been so successful, it is scary. And it's been a handful of people, a handful of billionaires who've decidedly shaped the course of our present day reality in which we find ourselves in this dire situation. And it started in the 1970s, really took hold in the 80s, in the 90s, and now up to present day. Things have gotten bad. And there are 2 main phases of this anti-democracy movement, and it's very important that we all understand what they've done, because my point today is going to be that we must replicate it. We must translate this strategy into a democracy movement. But what this anti-democracy movement has done, it started with the premise, in some respects, that if we're going to create rule by minority, we have to make sure that people are either unable to know it's ruled by a minority or accept it. So there's been an ideological battle about democracy, about government, about our role in our society, where you have the funding, a handful of billionaires funding think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, that tell us that government is inefficient. The only thing we can do is turn our fates over to the private market, because that is the most efficient. That is scientifically proven to be the most efficient allocation. Now, yeah, people are going to die because of poverty, but please, any market, any government interference, that'll just screw things up, and we'll turn into socialism. We'll turn into Russia. We'll turn into the Soviet Union. We'll turn into, Venezuela. So people all of a sudden start willing to say, well, we don't want government interfering in our markets. We want the market to allocate everything themselves. We have the consolidation of media, where the vast majority of us get our news from a handful of corporations. We have a handful of billionaires, and actually one billionaire family specifically, that funded 83% of all the academic resources to fund a new thing in the 80s called law and economics, which is a right-wing way of viewing the law, turning everything over to rational choice and market mechanisms to deal with law. So what a surprise, you have the Federalist Society and all these right-wing groups setting the groundwork for us to now live in a society where Brett Kavanaugh is considered a reasonable choice for the Supreme Court. There's been an ideological effort to normalize what were once fringe ideas and turn them mainstream. I might be too young, and I know this is surprising to a lot of you. I wasn't alive when Milton Friedman, the world-renowned economist, became famous. But once upon a time, Milton Friedman, this really far-right economist, was a hack. He wasn't considered legitimate in academia. He wasn't considered a legitimate economist in the mainstream. But when these think tanks kept pushing and pushing and pushing his thought in white papers, to lobbying and all this stuff, he became the godfather of modern economics. They have effectively shifted the ideological window so far to the right that the majority of us are considered fringe. Ideas that were once extremely popular under FDR and kind of normal policies under the New Deal are now seen as liberal extremists. It's ridiculous, but it's true. Obamacare was a Heritage Foundation plan. Obamacare was the conservative solution to health care. But they shifted that window so far to the right that Obamacare is the best we could do. And it's not just that, they've also delegitimized government itself, because the ideas are one thing, but when people see it in practice, it's a different thing. It makes it much more clear that when you show government doesn't work, when you show that we can't collectively decide our future, like when a handful of Republicans took our government hostage in 2013 over a budget negotiation, and we went into government shutdown, costing the taxpayers $23 billion. They showed government doesn't work. Look, they can't even decide on the budget. The baseline of any democratic society is a budget. And look, Congress couldn't do it, and all of a sudden congressional approval ratings plummeted. The majority of Americans after that happened didn't believe Congress could be trusted passing another budget the next year. So government itself, democracy itself, has been delegitimized through the intransigence of the Republican Party. They've fundamentally tried to commit a suicide mission on our democracy because they see that if we make it not work, people will lose faith in it and turn their fate over to the private market. And I can go on and on about this ideological warfare, because it really is warfare. Let's not, and they treat it as such. There's a book that they distributed in 2000 called The Art of Political War. I believe that was the title. And in which it basically argued that politics, that ideology is war. I always like to joke that Republicans seem to have understood Marxist theory better than any leftist ever has, because they understood the power of ideas. That's how you control. If you shape the ideas, if you shape the narrative, you control the policies. You control what is reasonable. You control what is fringe. So all of us, all of you who might have been reasonable in the 70s and 80s, y'all are now lefty crazies over here in New York, the People's Republic of the Upper West Side. And they've succeeded in this, but they haven't just succeeded in that, because that's one part. The other part is much more insidious, which is they've just straight up rigged the rules. So I talked about the House and Senate and presidency, but the amount of money in politics, the systematic attacking of all regulations of money in politics. The last election cost $6.4 billion, and of that, 2/3 of that money was funded by 0.5% of Americans. So about 100,000 people are the gatekeepers of who can run for office, who's considered legitimate, and once they're in office, what policies they think about. It's not just about that they bribe, but when you're just talking to rich people all the time, all you think about is the concerns of rich people. You're not thinking about who's on the streets. You're not thinking about how to cure homelessness, how to make sure everyone has a livable wage. You're not thinking about this. You're thinking about, well, maybe we can raise the retirement age, because look at my friends. None of them have back problems because they haven't been lifting boxes for the last 40 years. They've been over on their yachts relaxing. But that's how this shifted. You see gerrymandering in 2010, the lines have been shifted so that the Democrats are now in a situation where they have to get about 11% more than the Republicans to win a majority. Estimates between 7 and 11. 11 is the high end. That's not a democracy, but that's been deliberate. The use of new technology and big money coming together in 2010 to rig the lines, to control who's going to be elected, not the people controlling who's elected. And of course, the assault on the right to vote has been really, I think, the most disgusting thing. The Supreme Court, we started off with the Supreme Court, but in 2013, before Kavanaugh, right, when we still had that real liberal Anthony Kennedy, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. They gutted the provision called preclearance. I won't go into details, but basically that was the linchpin of it. That was one of the most important provisions, probably the most successful piece of civil rights legislation outside of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That one part of the Voting Rights Act changed America, and they gutted it. And the moment they gutted it, it freed southern states to enact whatever they wanted, essentially, in the moment. And so they did. They passed voter ID laws that are known to disenfranchise people of color, students, the elderly, the people who vote Democratic. They reduced the number of polling places. In 2016, there were 686 fewer polling locations in places with a history of racial discrimination than there were in the previous cycle. They make it hard for people to vote, and that is unacceptable. They're rigging the rules, and we have to call it for what it is. They're trying to create, both through manufactured consent of people who don't believe in democracy or believe the market will allocate everything, that we can just turn it over to the private forces. Through manufactured consent and the rigging of the actual rules, we have gone into a situation now where it is rule by minority. Let's not pretend otherwise. I'm not saying that it's impossible for us to win, but we may win 1 out of every 10 times, despite the fact that our country is split ideologically 50-50, or really 33-33-33, between right, middle, and center. It's not a fair fight, and we cannot lose sight of that. Therefore, it is imperative that we start thinking about what are the institutions in which we govern ourselves? What are the rules of the game? We must focus on the rules so that we can start fighting on the issues. As long as the rules are not equal, we cannot have a fair fight on the issues, whether it is Roe v. Wade, environmental policy, a livable wage, or, quite frankly, abolishing ICE. We will never win those fights in the long term if we are constantly at a disadvantage. But here's the thing. I promised you I would say something good, because things are bad and we can't just operate with the pessimistic frame that everything is going to hell, which in some respect it is. But that doesn't mean we can't change it. It doesn't mean we can't change our path to hell, because we've done it before. We've been in bad situations before in human history, and we can change it. So we have to recognize everything I just said, but not let that deter us from action. And here's the key. There is a democracy movement arising across the United States, whether or not you hear about it. I would attribute a lot of that to the consolidation of media and, frankly, the lack of interest around democracy, which I think is a shame. But there are people rising up across the United States. Danny mentioned that we marched from Philadelphia to D.C. on Democracy Spring. He didn't mention that 1,300 people were arrested on the Capitol steps demanding a better democracy. So in states across the country, people are rising up and winning. So yeah, nationally we are bad. But states, for better or worse, and I do mean for better or worse, because this anti-democracy movement has leveraged states to really experiment on what is the most racist, what is the most anti-democratic policies we can enact, like in Kansas, where they require or try to require proof of citizenship to register to vote. How many of you bring a passport when you go to the mall? Well, that's what would be required if you were to go in Kansas before it was struck down. But we can do the same thing, and we have been doing the same thing, but trying to push our democracy to a place where it has never been. Because it's not enough to make America great again, because our democracy was never great. We've been improving, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist, it doesn't take a political scientist, it doesn't take someone who's all that even bright to realize our democracy has really always been bad. It's been better, but it's never been great. If you're white, maybe you think otherwise, but talk to someone of low socioeconomic level or a person of color, and they'll tell you something along those lines. But in states across the country, we're winning. And I want to list a few of them, because it's not just enough to say it, but I want to give you some concrete ways in which we're winning. Maine. In 1996, Maine, via ballot initiative, passed public financing of elections. And they got it on the ballot, and they tried to go to the pollster, and basically I'll explain what the policy is in a second. But before that, they went to a pollster, and the pollster said, I'm not going to take your money to poll this ballot initiative. because you have no chance of winning. And so what this was is it was a way in which if you go around and collect $5 from 50 people, the state will fund your campaign for State House. So you don't spend your money you don't spend your time raising money, you spend your time talking to your constituents. And now, even though the pollster wouldn't actually take their money and decided you had no shot, they ended up winning by 12%. They hit it out of the park. And so politicians across Maine are diverse, come from working class backgrounds. In fact, Maine has the largest percentage of working class people in their legislature. And all of a sudden, policies, like environmental policies that were never considered realistic, started passing because you got rid of those special interests. They proved you can do it, and they did it. But you might be thinking, okay, that's 1996, a lot's changed since 1996. I was 3 years old then. Yeah, I am that young. But I'm not 14, some people think. In 2015, Seattle passed a voucher system where every resident gets 4 $25 vouchers that they can give to any local candidate that they want. And in 2017, it went into effect for the very first time. The results are stunning. You had homeless people giving political contributions for the first time in their lives. And you listen to the testimonies of that, what it means to be a part of political society when you've been cast out on the fringe for so long, economically, socially, politically, when the politician not only has to talk to you, but ask for your money, and then say, what do you want? What do you want to see this world be in 5 years? Imagine the shift in the life of that person, and not just that, but domestic workers, everybody in the city. So all of a sudden, issues of homelessness, domestic workers' Bill of Rights started coming up after the elections, because those are the constituencies that you now have to reach out to. That's just one radical transformation. New York City, by the way, is considering a voucher system. So we'll see how that goes. Oregon became the first state to bring our voter registration systems into the 21st century. They passed something called automatic voter registration. It's kind of a little small policy change that when you go to the DMV, instead of them asking you, do you want to register to vote, and they give you a form, they just do it for you. And if you want to opt out, you can. You know, you think that's such small potatoes. In the first 3 months of the program, the rate of new registrations tripled. There were almost 300,000, between 250 and 300,000 new registrants in Oregon in just 1 year of the program, and almost 100,000 of them voted for the first time. We can make our democracy work. California passed an independent redistricting commission. They took the power to draw the lines of the state and congressional maps, I believe it was both, out of the hands of the politicians who were going to rig it, and into the hands of the citizens. I mean, really, some of these things are that simple, that I could go to any high school, not just Bronx Science or Stuyvesant, but any high school that doesn't require a specialized test, and they could figure this out themselves. This is possible, and it's working. We have the policies, we have the movement, people are rising up to take their democracy back in states not just like New York, and frankly, New York has a long way to go with the state of our democracy here. It's bad, for those of you who don't know. It's bad in New York. But it's not just New York. In South Dakota, North Dakota, Missouri, Alaska, not only are people rising up, they are winning. South Dakota passed a voucher system in 2016 via ballot initiative. South Dakota voted for Republicans in 80% of all statewide elections in its history and voted for radical democracy reform. The legislature then said no and overturned it because they were like, no, you're not going to mess with this great, sweet deal we have right here. But citizens are trying to organize to override the veto right now in South Dakota. Deep red South Dakota. American democracy is a sacred thing. American democracy hits right to the core of who we are as Americans, despite the fact that we've never had a real democracy. You talk to anybody in the United States, whether they're Republican or Democrat, democracy hits home. So we're operating on an ideological playing field that I think we can win on, because I believe it's so ingrained in the American mythology that no one is going to come out as against democracy. And that's why we called it an anti-democracy movement, because if we frame it that way, if we start playing the ideological fight to frame it right back at them and say, you are a politician who is against democracy, that's not going to play well. It's not going to play well because democracy is something we hold dearly. And this gets me to the last point of my talk, which is we have the policies and we have the people, but there's one part of this democracy movement that I don't believe we've done enough. I don't believe we have replicated what the anti-democracy movement has done. And I do not believe that we have yet shifted the ideological window back to where it deserves to be. And I've recently been thinking about we need to stake out the positions that we actually want. What is the democracy that we want together? And we need to start demanding it. Because I've recently been thinking a lot about the victory of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And whatever you think about her, although I feel like in this audience, probably pretty positive, what she did in that race in New York 14, which if you don't know, she's the one who won against the fourth most powerful congressional or congressman in the Democratic Party. An upstart 28-year-old Latina with very little money ran a grassroots campaign. But what she did is she stuck out the ideological window and didn't compromise. She didn't start from a place of compromise. She described the future that she wanted to see. She said, this is what I want. I want to abolish ICE. I believe everyone has a right to a house, to shelter, to food, to water, to clean water. Because remember, Flint still does not have clean water. She stuck it out and said, this is what I believe. I am not going to operate from this small ideological window that has been narrowed over the last 40 years. And what happened? She won, because God forbid she actually excited the electorate during a primary. And this is something that really gets to the core of this democracy movement, because Danny and I met for the second time in a march from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, with a group led by a young rabbi, a 27-year-old rabbi, a brilliant young man. He's 2 years older than I am, one of the most inspirational people I truly have ever met in my life. I call him my democracy rabbi. And he's operating in Pennsylvania. He was on the Democracy Spring March. He got excited and said, let's bring this back to Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania on these rankings is the 45th most corrupt state by all these different 12 metrics, I believe. He said, we need to do something. We need to take this fight home. And yeah, Pennsylvania is a heck of a place to start your organizing career. A state that has a double red legislature and a rising neo-Nazi population in the center of the state. It's not the easiest to have that be your first real organizing gig. But he said, what's being a spiritual leader if not being a political organizer? And so he got a bunch of ragtag people, all the stragglers from Democracy Spring, formed an organization with no money, and said, let's do this. Let's start lobbying. Let's just go into the Capitol and start lobbying everybody we can. So they met with 230 out of the 253 legislators. They walked from Philadelphia to DC, Philadelphia to Harrisburg, 100 miles over 9 days, which we were both on. And then they engaged in civil disobedience in the Capitol to force the encounter with the politicians that refused to listen to them, to make them see in the face of the democratic citizens demanding reform. They said, look into my face and demand that I be arrested. Look into my face. Because when we see the face of the other, as my friend Michael would always say, you are ordered and ordained to service. It's hard to turn someone away when you make that lobbying visit personal. Now, they were all arrested, and they've been arrested multiple times. And ever so surely, they kept making progress on a bill to ban redistricting. And about a month ago, they got a vote. And it passed. And then they got blindsided. And then the Republicans in the State House totally screwed them over and killed the bill. But they got the vote. They got the power. But what they need to do now is shift that window open, to not operate from a place of compromise, because that's where they were. They were in the box. They were always in that box. But we need to shift that box so far over to democracy, not radical, not leftist, but shift the box of democracy, demanding universal registration. So when you turn 18, you're automatically registered. Lowering the voting age to 16. No one can look into my eyes and tell me the Parkland kids haven't proven otherwise. That you can be 16 and brilliant. Demand statehood for DC and Puerto Rico. There's so many of these different things that we can stake out that position, and we may not get there. We may not get there when we're in that meeting, but at least when we compromise, when we go into their offices. So I believe that if we have three things, we can win this fight for a better democracy. We already have the institutional framework in states across the country, and it's growing and getting stronger, but the actual framework of organizations to push the fight forward on the grassroots level. We have the policy framework that's been developed for a lot of the policies that are proven to work, that the grassroots can implement and actually make change. And I think if we get this last provision, which I've been talking about, shifting that ideological window over to the democratic side, where we actually can start operating from a place of what we actually want, instead of always operating from a place of compromise right in the beginning of negotiations. If we can develop that willingness to actually say out loud what we demand, what the kind of democracy we demand is, then I believe that we can win this fight. It's going to be tough and it's going to be a long fight, but if we can mimic the movements and the efforts of this anti-democracy movement, I believe we will win, and we must win, because our future relies on building the democracy that allows us to control our own future. Thank you so much.